Hey guys, it's Austin here with Out Jeeping, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you guys how to replace bump stops on your Jeep. Now today we're going to be replacing them on this 1999 Jeep Cherokee right behind me, but it's going to be the same process from 84 all the way to 2001. Now I'm just going to be doing the rear ones today, and while I'm at it I'm actually going to be taking the rear sway bar out of this because it's actually broken, and under the suspension as it goes up and down, part of it actually rubs on the inside sidewall of one of the tires. So I'm just going to delete it altogether, and a lot of you guys know that you don't even need them on a leaf sprung rear suspension vehicle unless you're really towing with like a heavy duty truck, but this thing's not going to be towing anymore, so I'm just going to be taking it out and I'll show you guys how to do that. So let's get started. Alright, so these are the bump stops that I have to replace in the Jeep today. They're made by Crown Automotive, and I got them from quadratrack.com. I'll post a link in the description below on where you guys can find them. But these are direct OEM replacement ones, and they're actually relatively cheap. I got these for like 12 bucks a piece. And with these bump stops, they don't come with any hardware, so we're going to have to reuse what's on the vehicle. And these are about 4.1 inches tall. So if you guys are curious on what the part number on these, it's right here. It's 520023993. So if you want to look that up and get these exact ones, you guys can go there. Alright, so the process I'm going to do on replacing these bump stops is I'm actually going to jack up the rear axle, put it on jack stands, and that way I can work on both sides at the same time. This is not really necessary if you're just doing the bump stops, but since I'm actually taking off the rear sway bar, I might be having to actually remove a U-bolt that holds in the axle. So I'm actually just going to do both sides at the same time. So I'm going to start off with that on jacking this thing up. And before we start jacking things up, remember that put the axle that's on the ground, make sure you have some blocks under it so that way it doesn't roll when the thing's up in the air. Other times you can actually get away with just putting it in four-wheel drive, but if you're not sure how your transfer case acts, or if it's like a full-time transfer case, sometimes it's not always locked up front. So just to be safe here guys, I got some blocks, and I'm going to put them in the front and back of the front tires. Now if you don't have an impact, now's the time to break free of your lugs, so that way it's on the ground. It has the friction of the ground to keep the wheel steady. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Alright, now we can repeat the process on the other side. Alright, so here's a quick tip for you guys. Some of you Jeep guys that have these acorn style lug nuts, a lot of the times these actually fail over time, and in the end result is actually having a stripped out lug nut, which actually kind of happened here today, but I was able to save it a little bit. Normally if it strips out completely, you're going to end up having to drill out the stud and putting a new one in, and that's kind of a pain in the butt. But I figured out the reason why these guys actually fail. There's a couple of them. This one right here, they actually like to delaminate from this little sheathing that's over here, and it just kind of pops off. And then, as you know, since you don't have this extra thickness of metal, the lug nut is actually going to be a little bit smaller, so you might actually get away with putting an 18 millimeter on here, but it still might be kind of tight and might have to hammer it on, which is, you know, not really efficient. Over here, what actually happened was I wasn't able to get the socket on all the way because it seemed like the sheathing kind of like bulged out, and I ended up having to cut off and remove most of the sheathing on here, and I found a bunch of rust built in between this lug nut here and the sheathing. And over time, if that rust kind of builds up in there, it'll bulge out that sheathing, and you won't be able to get your socket on there, and you won't be able to get it on all the way actually, and you might just have a little bit of contact on here, and you're going to end up stripping it, which is kind of like what was on here. I even tried hammering on here when the sheathing was originally on here, and it was just, you know, bulged up too much because of all that built up rust. So to prevent that, what you can do is just get some solid lug nuts. These things right here, these are just black ones, but Solid lug nuts, they don't have that sheathing. You won't have to deal with that extra layer that's on here and potential rust that could build in between them. So today I had 2 failed lug nuts, so I'm just going to be replacing these with some extra lug nuts I had from my old silver Jeep. Alright, so with the tires off, we can see a lot better in here. As you can see, right here is the rear sway bar, and this is on the passenger side. And right here is actually where it's broken, and this part here is actually supposed to be in the bottom over here, and actually kind of rotated as it was going down the road, and now it's kind of sitting a little bit up higher on this little tab here. So I'm just going to delete this rear sway bar altogether. The way I'm going to do that is you can either unbolt it from where the U-bolts go down to the axle, but I don't really want to disturb any of these rusted out threads here, so I'm just not going to necessarily unbolt it from there, but I'm going to unbolt it from this bolt right here. So that way I won't risk the chance of breaking a U-bolt, and that's more money that I'm going to have to spend later on. But if this bolt breaks right here, it's not a big deal. We can leave this little bracket on there. It shouldn't cause any problems. So as well as removing this bolt on either side, we also have 2 bolts going up into the body. These are going to be 2 15mm bolts that go straight up into there. There's a threaded nut that's welded on the inside of the frame. Normally these come out just fine. If they snap, once again, it's not a big deal because we're not going to be putting this back on. If you are going to be putting it back on and you want to make sure that the bolts don't snap out, what you could do is try to go through an access hole in the frame, try and squirt some PB Blaster on these threads over here. Other times you can actually take a torch and just kind of heat up the surface underneath over here where the welded nut would kind of be around, and that actually helps loosen it up a little bit so you're not struggling with it. But as far as the rear bump stops, this is normally where it would go right here, and as you can tell, the rubber on this fell off years ago, and it's just the metal bracket that's left here. And along here we also have 2 bolts going up into the frame, so we're going to be a little bit more cautious on taking these guys out. I'm going to see if I can find a access hole to squirt some in. Otherwise I'm just going to take a torch and just kind of heat up around the frame here and just kind of take it slow with the bolts, and hopefully they don't snap out. Now the purpose of bump stops or axle snubs, it's actually supposed to hit the body against the axle when the suspension is at full compression, and this is the way your tire's not digging into your fender or anything like that. It rarely ever happens, but if you hit that big pothole or if you're going off-roading or something like that, the axle can come up pretty high, and you want it to stop right at the axle bump stops, so that way you don't damage anything with your tire or any other suspension component. But first things first, we're going to go and remove this sway bar, and that should give us more room to do these bump stops. Alright, so once again, under here is a 15mm. I'm just going to try and zip these out with the impact. Sometimes if you take the extension off there, it gives you a little more torque. So that way it's not lost between all the joints with the extended piece in there. Those ones came out nice. Now since this is broken over here, I'm just going to go straight to the other side so we can get this removed. Alright, so this bolt that's up here, it's an 18mm bolt, so since these threads over here are exposed and not inside the frame, we can actually hit it with some PB Blaster, so that's what I'm going to do here. Now hopefully this bolt isn't rusted inside the bushing, because I'm going to try and remove it, break it free a little bit, and then I'm going to start hammering from the back side. Actually, I might just be able to thread it out like this. Alright, so it might be kind of tight in here, but basically the issue is that the bolt is not actually backing out all the way because it's hitting the backing plate for the drum brakes over here. But I just took a hammer, hammered it down, and it just gave me enough clearance, and now I got the bolt out. So now we can slide this. Now we can slide the bushing out of this recess here. Ouch, that right there did not feel good at all. But anyway, now our sway bar is all free, so now we just need to fish it out of here. We got brake lines that are in the way, we got the exhaust and the exhaust hanger, so this is where if you have another person, they can help on the other side, just kind of weave it around here. But since I'm by myself, just gonna have to do the best I can. Alright, so this is a sway bar out of the vehicle, and it was actually easier to take it out on the passenger side, so that way I can kind of work around that shock that's right there in the way. Unfortunately, the piece that broke, which was this bushing that was on the other side, the bolt is actually seized inside the bushing there, so I'm not actually able to take that off unless I cut the bolts, but for what it's worth, it's easier just to leave it back on. It shouldn't cause any problems. It's not going to be rubbing on anything. This rubber bushing right here was actually the piece that was rubbing on the sidewall of the inner side of the tire. So, and it was doing that because this was separated, and every time you go over bumps, this would actually kind of rise and rub up against the tire. But this piece, I just kind of swung it down so it's on top of that leaf spring holder, and it should be fine out of the way. Maybe later on, if I have to replace leaf springs again on this vehicle, I can take this off because it's held on by that bracket that's bolted on by the U-bolts. Alright, so now it's actually time to remove the old bump stops, or what's left of them. It's going to be two 13mm bolts, but on the driver's side you actually do have a little bit of an advantage. It should come out just a little bit easier than the passenger side. Now the reason being is you got your axle breather tube right here, and it actually goes to the frame rail from the other side over here. So as the differential heats up and everything like that, it has to have a vent tube. So sometimes you'll actually get a little oily residue that actually coats the inside of the frame over here. So as you know, oil kind of helps repel a little bit of water, so hopefully these guys come out a little bit easier. Now I'm actually going to be taking just a ratchet and try and do these by hand, see if feel them, if they're actually going to go free, and if they're going to snap, I'm going to take a torch and kind of heat them up. But just for now, I'm just going to take a wrench and feel if they're yielding or not, and then that way we'll see if they come out nicely. Oh yeah, this one should come out nicely. See if I can break the other side free. Ooh, that's not what we want. That one actually snapped. So you do got to be a little bit careful. I might end up drilling that out and putting a new bolt in. Alright, so this is just going to be your standard 5/16 thread pitch by 18 UNC. So I actually do have a tab for this, so I'm just going to end up drilling this side out and putting a new bolt in. And there's that old one. It's kind of rust welded to the frame, but as you can see, there's no rubber that's left on that guy. Alright, so unfortunately I had to drill that out. It's not too big of a deal, but it's kind of a pain in the butt to do sometimes. And I went ahead and tapped it for a 5/16 by 18. And to do that on the driver's side over here, I actually had to remove the shock on the lower end. That way I can fit my drill up in there and get it on straight. So another technique you could do in this instance is actually just take a nut and kind of weld it to that stud in there, and the heat from welding on there actually sometimes breaks that bond between that welded nut inside, and then you would be able to back that off. But I don't have a welder here today, so I just had to drill that out. Alright, so now with that tapped out, we can go and install our new bump stop. And with the bump stops, they're pretty universal for passenger or driver's side. The only difference is that one side has a normal hole and the other side has actually a slot hole. And for the Jeep Cherokee here, we're going to want to make sure that slot hole is on the back, so that way in case the distances for these bolts is a little bit different, this should line up right here because it has a little bit of wiggle room. And before I reinstall this, just in case I ever have to take this off again, I'm going to put some anti-seize on these bolts. Actually, I'm just going to put it inside these welded in nuts, so that way I don't have to get anti-seize on my fingers in case I drop these bolts. Now while I'm at it, I also have some extra 5/16 hardware, so if you have some new 5/16 bolts, might as well put them in. So now with the new hardware that I put in, the bolt head is actually a 1/2 inch. So now I'm just going to go and snug these guys up. I should also mention that I also did put a washer on here because we're just replacing with normal bolts compared to just a flange bolt. Alright, then you just want to snug those up, nothing crazy tight. Alright, so that's pretty much it for installation. Let's head over to the other side and do the same thing. Hopefully we'll have better luck on these bolts coming out. Alright, so on the other side here, I'm going to go straight and use a torch since the other side snapped. This side might be similar or maybe even worse. So I'm just going to heat those up real quick and see if we can zip those guys out. Just be careful with the torch because we do have a fuel tank right over here. On the other side there's also some fuel lines, so just keep an eye out for that. Alright, so it did break free a little bit, but since these are like kind kind of like starter bolts. They're not exactly round. They got like three, they're almost like a triangle shape thread, so it kind of cuts its way through. And in those voids kind of where the triangle is, they kind of build up with rust. So I think that's what I'm experiencing here, because it moves a little bit and then it kind of stops. So it's kind of clogged up with rust. So I'm just going to kind of work this back and forth, see if I can free it up a little bit and just try and work it out slowly. This beats trying to have to drill it out once again. Just got to be very careful when you start to feel the bolt to kind of yield. Stop and turn the direction and work it the other way. So it might be kind of hard to show you guys on camera, but basically this bolt isn't exactly round on the threads here. It's kind of like it sticks out in three spots, kind of like a triangle shape, and there's flat spots in here, and that actually fills up with rust. So it might kind of break free a little bit, but then it gets caught up on that rust, and then if you keep going it could possibly snap it, which probably would happen on the other side over there. So I just kind of worked this back and forth, and eventually I was starting to turn it even more, and this side popped out. So let's work on that other bolt and get that one out as well. So that moved a little bit forward. I moved back. And same deal on this one. I'm just gonna have to work this one back and forth until it eventually comes out. All right, so I got this one coming out nicely now. All right, look how crusty that one is. All right, so once again, I'm just gonna put a little anti-seize in these holes. Now one thing I like to do that you don't necessarily need to have to do it, but I like to put the bolts back in where the frame is, where the rear sway bar was, because that way it kind of plugs up that hole, and that way you won't have any salt or water getting in there and rotting out the frame from the inside. So I'm just going to put a little anti-seize in these holes as well, and then we can put the original bolts back into the holes. So once again, we're going to have that slot facing the rear, put in our new bolt with a washer, and then thread it back into place. And then snug these guys down. And I'm just going to feed these bolts that were for the rear sway bar in. Alright, that's pretty much all there is to it. Got both bump stops installed. Now we just got to throw on the wheels and retorque them down. Then we should be done. As you can see, it's pretty tight getting the socket off here. So I can tell down the road I'm going to probably have problems with these lug nuts since they're starting to go. So that'll be the next upgrade for this, get some new lug nuts. So now for this Jeep, I'm going to torque it down to 100 foot-pounds. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today's video. Overall, it's not something too difficult to install, but if you do have rusty bolts like I did, it can be a tedious process, and as we learned today, just taking those bolts, heating them up a little bit, and then slowly working them back and forth, it'll clean up the threads from all that rust and hopefully should come out nicely. I'll put a link in the description below on where you can find these bump stops. So if you found this video helpful, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel, and it helps these kind of videos keep coming. And if you guys have any questions or comments, make sure to post them below and I'll be happy to answer them. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.